Yeah, I think it's pretty fair to say that I demonstrate that smartness by not being in Geelong any longer. Hi, I'm John Barton. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to take a quick photo of you all because I work for a startup and I don't make much money, so I need something else to show Mum that I'm doing okay. That's going straight on Facebook. It's going to be awesome. So there's 3 things you kind of need to know about me and why I'm giving this talk. The first is, before I was a Ruby guy, I was a .NET guy, and I did a lot of the scaling work for mycareer.com.au, Australia's second biggest job board. The second thing is that I helped grow Envato to the size it is today. I joined when our CEO was doing his Tim Ferriss travel the world, remote working type thing, and there were 3 devs in a co-working office, and I left just a little bit before Envato was big enough to afford to take the Ruby sponsorship level at this conference, so that's a pretty big gap between those 2. And then finally, I work for a startup now, which is quite a bit smaller than Envato, with quite a bit less money in the bank. So if you think about it this way, the talk is the web scale for the rest of us. Envato taught me the web scale, and being poor again has taught me about the rest of us. The kind of key thing I want to talk about in this talk is that, as awesome as Braintree's, Paul's talk on the Braintree stack was, you don't want to build that shit for your startup. Not immediately. That stuff is out of control crazy, and it's not kind of appropriate to your thing. So I find the topic of scaling Rails applications kind of tricky to talk about, because the longer I'd been building Rails apps, or any kind of software, is the more the answer to every single question became, it depends. Should I do this? Well, it depends. What about this? Well, it depends. Thankfully, some kind of jerk on the internet gave me a bit of an out. The Rails is omakase blog post, or the most pretentious rationalization for excluding RVM, or including RVM. I can't remember what it is. This was my first reaction to the blog post, that, well, that's a kind of a big pile of stink for essentially my opinion. But on further reflection, I actually think it's a pretty handy kind of analogy, metaphor. We're software developers, so we rely pretty heavily on our metaphors. So if DHH wants to think he's this guy, fine. Does anyone know who this is? Cool. Not enough of you. There's a fantastic documentary about the world's best omakase chef, Jiro someone. You can get it on Netflix. Watch it. It's really, really good. So anyway, I decided I'm going to use the Rails omakase analogy and beat it to death for this talk today. Because I wouldn't be a very good software developer if I didn't rely heavily on a leaky abstraction. So if we look at DHH as our omakase chef and the Rails is our menu, then I consider that menu to cover the way we develop software, and I want to talk a bit about how you operate that software. So I want you to kind of consider my perspective like the match wine list to the pretentious sushi menu you've got. So consider me your sommelier. I'm from Geelong. It's incredibly surprising I know that word. So before I get any further in, I just want to define a few terms. So in my mind, scaling is doing whatever makes your business more money for less than you make. So, and the money that's left over is called profit. I've seen it before. I haven't seen it recently. So the funny thing is, if let's say you're hypothetically some kind of startup guy, and you're sitting in a meeting with investors, and you have the discussion about scale, they're not going to ask you how many dynos you're running, how many Node.js's and Mongos are in your stack. They're more asking about how many salespeople you're going to get to hit all your sales targets. And I'm like, what's the sales target? What are sales figures? I don't know. I finally figured out that the business person's version of MongoDB benchmark figures, they're talked about a lot, but they have very little impact on your day-to-day work. So anyway, into terms. Scaling, doing more. I'm mixing in a lot of concepts about high availability when I talk about scaling, because in my mind, the two things go hand in hand. Downtime is essentially anti-scaling. You're going backwards. You're meant to go up and to the right, and you're going still to the right, but you're going down. And usually if you're actually having scaling problems, it leads to availability problems. So the two things, in my mind, are very tightly linked. So I'm going to mix together a few concepts about kind of scaling up and not falling over as kind of the same thing. So the other thing about scaling being about doing more of what makes you money is it's not just serving web traffic. It's also preserving the ability to evolve your application over time. Your business isn't just going to grow on its own. You're going to be changing your software ideally a few times a day, but let's say daily, to meet the needs of new customers. And so your software will evolve, you'll get new customers. That'll put more demands on your stack. So the two things kind of come together. So that's kind of what I mean by scaling. You need to be able to develop more software out to more people cheaply, or cheaply enough for the amount of money you take out of them. So for me, very cheaply indeed. So coming back to our sushi menu kind of metaphor, leaky boat abstraction, what have you. These are the kind of things that DHH likes the aesthetic of. Some of them are technical choices, like CoffeeScript or the use of bundler. Things like TDD, I mean, there are technical choices in their support, but they're a lot more about practices. So it's a combination, it's a bit of a statement of develop software this way using these practices and these tools. So the wine list that goes with that, in my mind, is to have more than 2 developers doing DevOps on the most boring version of the Rails stack you can imagine, across 2 web servers in front of a SQL database, 2 SQL databases. I've spoken on the specifics of this stack before and blogged a little bit about it, so I'm not going to get too much into the technical end because this is the stuff that changes, but the core idea of 2 and 2 and 2 won't. I think this is the best way to develop and deploy Rails applications. I feel comfortable saying that because even though I very strongly believe in it depends and respond to your situation intelligently, I'm relying on DHH's pattern of have an opinion and just spit it out there. So the kind of first key principle that kind of guides my mind in thinking about this is actually Corey Haynes' talk yesterday morning was really helpful for this, about having to know the heritage of all your practices, your software development practices, your tools. You've kind of got to understand the history. And so the first thing is I think Rails and DevOps go hand in hand. You can have DevOps without Rails, but you can't sensibly have Rails in production without some kind of DevOps environment. I was just going to drop this slide and say QED. But this is essentially why, is that over time, RAM gets cheap, programmers get expensive. If you're in a traditional organization with one ops team that's on one floor of a building and a development team on another floor, it doesn't make sense to have something like Rails because memory bloats like crazy. But if you've got one guy making the kind of spending decisions both on how am I going to allocate my development time or my operations time and my money on budgets, Rails it's perfect. It makes perfect sense because you can make those trade-offs. But when you've got one guy with a budget for servers and RAM and taking care of those, he's just going to say you need 5 more servers to serve the equivalent amount of traffic to a .NET app because of all this memory bloat. And so they'll never sign off on it. Every now and then I do a little bit of consulting, and so I have sat in a room with the traditional enterprise ops team and tried to convince them that it is perfectly okay for our Rails app to use 10 times as much memory as a JVM. It is fine. But they didn't believe me because they don't see the corresponding savings in the development team. So this is why the DevOps and Rails goes really well together, is because of that trade-off. In fact, DHH loves to post pictures of all the RAM he's just bought on his blog. Like, this is the psychology driving the shape of your framework, so you may as well play to its strengths. So the other reason that I think DevOps and Rails go hand in hand is that compared to something like the JVM, Rails deployment options like a Unicorn or Mongrels back in the day or Passenger don't give an ops team very many levers to pull. They just grow in memory. You can add another process, maybe remove it, add some more memory to a box, but there's not much to do. Usually if there's some kind of performance or scaling change, you need to go all the way back to the development team to do the most efficient work to resolve that problem. So yeah, if you've got heavily siloed dev and ops, Rails is not a very good framework because the team that takes care of making the app go scale doesn't have enough levers to pull to do that effectively, and the dev team has no connection to that and can't help. So yeah, always consider the fact that you're going to be working really closely with your ops team. Maybe you're not going to have one early on. So the next thing that I think is really, really important with deploying Rails applications is to use a single responsibility principle. It's something we all use for our code, but not that many people think that it also applies to servers. So I'll quote Brian Kernighan. Actually, I'll paraphrase because it's shorter. The old statement about debugging is twice as hard as writing a program. So if you're as clever as you can be writing it, how are you ever going to debug it? And so things like the single responsibility principle or any of these kind of software design heuristics we use are essentially giving constraints to make our code less clever, easier to reason about, easier to maintain in the long term, to work with. And so the single responsibility principle, I think, is the most kind of convertible between developing software, developing an operations stack. Because it's handing you code. You can tell from the name of something what it does. It has one job, and you know why it does what it does, how it does what it does. And if you need to change that, that's easy. So I think it applies to servers as well. But it's not just around change or purpose. It also helps isolate out that stack component in the way its performance will degrade over time. Because if you've got, let's say you've got your database on the same slice as your Rails processes, and memory starts running out, you've got two things to look at. Whereas if you've got your database isolated from your app servers, you get some kind of alert that says, oh, I'm running out of memory in my database. I guess I've got a database problem. You've just saved yourself an entire component of your problem-solving process. It's not necessarily that efficient for a startup to have to split your database from your app servers in kind of raw dollars. But the same way that the RAM prices and the developer prices overlap, the kind of developer price of the troubleshooting process to work that out is a lot more expensive than paying the cost of having that extra server. So as soon as practical, as soon as you've got the money in your pocket to do it, I strongly advocate separating out your app processes from your database. The number one fail that I see in terms of violating the single responsibility principle, and one that I am currently violating myself, is the util server. Hands up if you've got a util server in your stack somewhere. That is not as common as I expected. I am not as good a person to go give this talk as I thought. Yeah, so the other thing about the single responsibility principle, there's a few reasons you really, really want to bring down the troubleshooting cost of each component of your stack. The first is developers are terrible operations people. I'm all for reducing the amount of kind of operations involved in your stack, but not because I don't think ops guys aren't great, because they are awesome. They're really good at doing what they do. But developers are not those people. It's a different mindset. You're always thinking about the ways things break rather than the way to create things. The other reason is that this shit always fucks up at 3 a.m. Has anyone tried to do difficult work at 3 a.m.? It doesn't work very well. So you really want to bring this kind of constraint in on your stack so that you can, as an unskilled operations person at 3 a.m., successfully resolve your problems. So the next principle that is really, really important in kind of deciding on your early stack is YAGNI. So YAGNI was like the best thing I learned as an early programmer. We've all been in that situation where we just code that little bit extra because we know what's coming next. Oh, the next feature is going to need this, and I'll just put this little API in place and I'll plug this thing over here. And then by the time comes to do the next feature, you were completely wrong. You've got to tear it all down and build the next thing. The same thing happens with ops. Generally, one thing will bottleneck as you're growing. And if you think you know what it is, you're wrong. So if you're preemptively building components of your stack to address your future bottleneck, all that's going to happen is something else will bottleneck, and you'll have a hard time figuring it out because you've built the wrong thing. So I want to put a caveat on the use of YAGNI, because it's there's nothing forcing you to add another feature to your app. I mean, you might feel like your CEO is forcing you, kind of shoving a bit of pressure down the business pipe, but ultimately, the only thing that's painting you into a corner developing your code is you. So you can choose to build the next thing or not build the next thing, and that's fine. The problem with actual operations is you don't have full control over the next thing that's going to happen. Your marketing department may have finally figured out that perfectly viral email that needed to happen to get your growth up, and that's nothing to do with you. So you've still got to leave a little bit of room. So who's seen Ronin? Okay, that's better. I couldn't get a screen cap of the exact scene from this, but does everyone remember when he's put the gun by the back door of the cafe where they're doing the meat of the secret shit, and they're doing that, and he's shuffling behind the crate, and he's in a trench coat, and it looks well sketchy? That's the kind of backup plan you want to have with your ops in the early days. I want you to think Ronin. I don't want you to think Ocean's 11. Because you look at the Braintree talk, that was a fantastic architecture, but it's a very elaborate plan that is very specific to their problems. You don't have their problems. You don't need the 10 moving parts and then the little Chinese guy in the box in the safe. I mean, Envato's got a little Chinese guy they'll put in a box. But that's specific to their situation.
The problem is we can't get him to stay in the box.
Yeah, so applying YAGNI to your stack is, I think, really, really important, because you don't want to get ahead of yourself. You don't build the wrong thing, but you do need to have some kind of awareness of the big picture. You kind of need to have a little list of if I start running out of disk space, what do I do? And you buy more disks. That's an easy one. I start running out of RAM. Stop writing Rails code. That'll probably do it. Oh, my database is working too hard. You've probably forgotten index. If not, buy a bigger database. So you want to be ready for all these things. You want to stash little guns in every corner so that as things happen, you can respond to them. But just promise me you won't overthink it. Don't install React yet. So caching. Caching's kind of a funny one, and this is probably the only thing in this talk that I'm not going to take a strong position on, because it really varies from application to application as to whether it's the right thing for you to do. So I tend to talk a lot of ops stuff with Ben Hoskins of The Conversation. We disagree very often. But there's one thing that we very much agree on, is that for a site like The Conversation, it's very news heavy, it's very read heavy, that caching is an important part of how that should work. So build that early. Have that in your stack, because 90% of your users are passively engaging with it. They're just consuming content. It's the right thing to do in that case. If you've got a site like the world's greatest social film review site, Good Films, there's a lot of user-specific content. So everyone's logging in, getting their own data. So you don't want to put caching in prematurely there, but you do want to keep it up your sleeve, because it's one of those things at 3 a.m. if we've got a cap task that if a page is giving us trouble, you can just go cache that. Take this problem away, I'm going back to sleep. I'm probably still drunk. So for apps like that, I think it's your biggest get out of jail free card. But you don't want to rely on it, and you probably want to take down the cache in the morning, because the reality is that even if it's you've had a big spike of traffic that's come in on a landing page, for example, you use that as your performance testing for when your signed-in user count grows to your traffic level of your non-signed-in users right now. It's the best way to get kind of free performance testing. Otherwise, over time, you're just going to have to run Apache Bench every few weeks and make sure, are we still ahead of the game? Let your users tell you that you're still in good shape. So that's why I think it's very much an it depends kind of topic. So I'm going to kind of come back to, this kind of relies on YAGNI a little bit, but this is kind of my feeling on MongoDB. It's essentially a strong social signal that you and I will not be friends. It's, and I don't, no, I do mean to be harsh on MongoDB. My other favorite joke about it is that dev null doesn't look enough like billable hours. But that's enough MongoDB bashing for now. So I very strongly believe if you're building your startup on Rails, you should be deploying to some kind of SQL database. And to kind of go back to where Corey was talking about heritage and the way it's kind of talking about Rails and DevOps, those things go hand in hand. Rails and regular, boring SQL databases belong together. They were built together. The databases existed long before Rails, but Rails' entire structure is based around having SQL databases. I know there's active model now in Rails 3, and you can drop in any data store you like. But I feel that if you want to play to Rails' strength and spend the least time messing about with operation stuff, you should stick with what kind of the matched wine for that food choice. The other reason I really, really like sticking with SQL is that it keeps your options open. When you've got a SQL database, you have a lot of guns and a lot of corners for your next plan. Because if you are really, really stuck, you've got a lot of options to get out of trouble. You can vertically scale your database. I'm sure you can do that with, you know, I don't know, what's the joke, new joke DB? So I'm not beating the same horse. Rethink, yeah. I'm sure Rethink can scale vertically, but I'm not sure. That's actually the key point, and no one's sure. The other thing is you can hire DBAs out of other tech stacks that know how to make your database really performant. You've got options to get out of trouble with your database. When I say this though, Goodfilms is deployed to Postgres. I use Postgres for all my new projects. But every time I see someone on Twitter carry on about MySQL being a toy database, I find myself mentally checking like the patent database for the Twitter slapping device. Because I think it's pretty ridiculous. As far as I'm concerned, they're both very viable production stacks. I was talking to Glenn, my co-founder, about this the other day, and the best way I could express it was that if I took a job somewhere and they say, oh, our app is running on Postgres, I go, great. And if they go, our app's deployed on MySQL, okay, yeah, that's fine, we can work with that. Oh, we've got some MongoDB that also has some, what's that new thing out of Stripe where you can stream your MongoDB into Postgres? I'd say, okay, step one, we're getting rid of that. So that's kind of how I feel about the databases. So anyone that is really pro Postgres, you've got a few lols on your ledger. Selecting a count from a query is a bit ridiculous. And setting up replication feels like some kind of weird legacy game of Twister, where it's a special case of binary replication is actually kind of a backup restore. And to turn it off or on, you've got to have a file present to say, I've finished restoring my backup. I'm not doing a backup restore, I'm replicating. And then before anyone in MySQL gets too smug, well, we just know what it does to data. So, you know, they've both got pluses and minuses. My personal feeling with scale is that MySQL is actually a little bit better when you go past one box. The replication, most of the early sites that did scaling were scaling on MySQL, so they're a very robust tools and processes for scaling horizontally there, but Postgres past 9 are fine for that as well. So I don't think there's particularly strong arguments either way on the scaling operations front to say choose one or the other. I think there's very strong arguments around the way you develop and the way Postgres is a lot nicer to work with, but operationally either one is fine. So this is where I'm getting a bit into availability. The golden rule is if you can't afford 2, you can't afford 1. That's servers, that's developers, it's anything. You never want a single point of failure, except when you can't afford 2. My favorite area in breaking this rule is around load balancers, because I find the risk of someone cocking up load balancer config in 2 places higher than the risk of a load balancer randomly dying for no reason. But let's say generally, as a general rule, 2 is better than 1. So the first case for why you need to have 2 for anything is high availability, or just any kind of availability. Servers fail all the time. It's not just servers too. Like if you think of when you're doing your product development, your project manager might be asking you about what your project's bus factor is. So you still have to think about high availability in your development team, because 1 bus, project's gone. So as soon as possible, go to 2. In fact, in a lot of ways, you can start thinking about development practices and ops a lot the same as if you think of your card wall as your load balancer across your 2 developers. You kind of stream, your business person streams in requests, and each one picks one up and gives it back or drops it on the ground, which is more common than you'd think. So now the other reason I say you want to push to two servers, 2 developers, is that there are only 3 numbers in computer science: 0, 1, and many, or n if you want to be a little bit more scientific about it. So that's not just an availability thing, but that is a strong component. You've got redundancy, one thing can fail, the other one can't. The other is it's to help the design of each component, is that you may accidentally, well, the same reason I was making the argument about single responsibility principle and saying you want to isolate out your database from your app service this way, is you're going to have pain when you want to horizontally scale any part of your stack as well. And you want to go through that pain when in a calm and controlled situation. Because if you've not horizontally scaled your app, let's say your app tier yet, and you're getting Reddit front page in the middle of the night, you go, oh, okay, this can't be hard. I've got a bunch of Puppet scripts to build my app server, and I'll just spin up the second one. That'll work fine. But until you've actually gone through the act of going from 1 to 2, you'll find there's all kinds of things you forget, unless you're a massive pedant. But I'm not, so I forget things. And I'm guessing that at least 2/3 of this room aren't big enough pedants to remember everything in your op stack. So the easy one to think of is if you've got Postgres, you may have forgotten that your PG HBA conf needs extra IP addresses in. And so you start deploying your horizontally scaled app tier, and none of them can talk to the database. It's even fun, to be honest, the separation thing, it matters much more going from the app to separating out the app tier from the database tier, because you might have forgotten you're actually talking over a socket, and then when you finally figure out I've got to set up the port, you realize you haven't set it up on the firewall, and then you finally set up the firewall and you forget PG HBA conf also provides some kind of firewall security for your database, and you don't want to figure those things out at 3 a.m. because they're going to take hours at that stage. It's like a 5-minute little checklist when you kind of got your coffee in hand in the morning going, okay, I'm ready to set up my stack. But, you know, bleary-eyed, looking at the computer going, what's that IP address? Oh, typing it wrong. It's terrible. So go through the pain early as you can. And I think this holds for developers as well. I've been the 3rd developer on a product. No, the 2nd developer on the product 3 times in my career, and every time I say never again. And I'm not working with bad programmers. Like Glenn here, my co-founder, is a really good programmer, and I warned him before the talk, I'm going to drop him in the shit a little bit. there's something about it's the same way as that if your app tier is actually talking to the database over a socket. Things like class names are less communicative because they're more like pointers to a internal design discussion he's had in his head a month ago, rather than a thing that's to communicate amongst peers. It's not really a communication tool, it's a reminder tool. So everything in your application structure is to help remind you of things, not to help you necessarily communicate things. I think, and it's the kind of thing that every developer wants to fight that instinct and do the best job they can with writing good code. But it's a thing people do, and there's no point getting angry about it. So your code base is going to be in better shape the sooner you can get that second developer. So I would pull that forward. If you've got a solo project that looks like it's going to become a business, like get a team as soon as possible, and then get a couple of servers for everything as soon as possible, because it actually forces you to recognize the interfaces everywhere. And by making them explicit ahead of time, you're just going to be in a better position for the maintainability of your app over time. That sentence probably wasn't very good. Right, so Corey Haynes, Emu March. I think that's a fantastic idea. So who's heard of John Allspore before? So not very many of you. I have a massive man crush on this guy. Like, it's a little bit insane. And if I ever go to a conference, I'll be even more awkward than when I was buying 10 to love a drink last night. So he runs ops for Etsy. Now, Etsy's a PHP shop, so you'd think, I'm Rails, I'd have nothing to learn from those PHP noobs. But the thing is, they run a really, really good shop, and they do a lot of good ops work. So I'm planning on spending March trying to emulate him. I'm going to try and share as much ops information. So he writes fantastic blog posts. He's got a particular one about more like a nuanced idea of availability that I strongly recommend everyone reads. He kind of talks about not all uptime being equal, and some things that whether degraded performance should be considered. Does that mean your site's not available? Or it doesn't matter as much if it's in the middle of the night and something's down? Or is it okay to piss off a certain percentage of customers all the time, or a large percentage of them all at once? I don't know, really smart guy. So read his stuff. And I'm going to try and share the same way that he's sharing stuff about ops. When it's big, I'm going to make sure I churn out 4 blog posts next month about ops when it's little. So I think I kind of want to thank Corey for putting forward such a good idea, and I think everyone should do it. So I've got a bit of time left, so I wasn't sure if I was going to talk quickly or slowly. So I want to talk a bit about how I've used those ideas to structure the tech stack for good films. So we've got actually 2 products. We've got the main site, which is if you haven't heard, is the world's best social film rating network, gadget, boondoggle out there. So that product kind of sits on one side. And on the other side, we actually do provide a market research analytics tool product for the movie industry to look at which films are doing well within which demographics. So 2 products we keep completely isolated because partly because I don't want to accidentally leak anyone's private information to someone that's buying it. Stuff gives me bad juju. And don't want the karma. So I think that this is interesting, though, because both apps have the same resource constraints in developers and budget because they're coming out of the same company at the same time, but have very, very different constraints because they're very different kinds of product. So Good Films is hosted currently on Rackspace Cloud behind a load balancer. We have 2 app servers. We have a util server, which I said don't have, but we've got one. A database master and a database slave. And so running unicorns and Nginx, and that's about it. It's as boring and vanilla a stack as you can get. And we've made those choices because if you consider with the social network, you're making basically no money per user. So we're incredibly cost sensitive and we want everything under our control. And so that we can start adding new servers whenever we like, and we can turn them off when we don't need them. So we hit the front page of Reddit, we got up to 5 app servers across the front, and then as that slowly tail down. We just kill the server. We're not paying for them. And we don't mind spending the extra time putting the care into the operations and maintaining that stack because the cost efficiencies are really, really important to us. So we kind of do that. But with our other product, there's like, how many movie studios are there? Maybe like 5 of the big ones, the ones with the kind of money we want. So we kind of know that there's an upper ceiling in the amount of users that will use this app. So that product's actually developed on Sinatra, and it's designed to host on Heroku. Why Heroku on this app but not on the other is because it's bloody expensive, and it does routing lols. Like, I kind of don't want to spend that much money for that much hassle in serving traffic, but I wouldn't care if I had to buy 5 dynos per customer for that product because the pricing structure of that is enough that it makes sense. Another customer, another 5 dynos, big deal, it's covered in the billing, that makes sense. The other reason that we choose Heroku for that is because it's so operationally simple. Really, really simple. So we're trading in that situation a bit of money for operational simplicity so that we've got more headspace to actually work on the product we're passionate about, the helping people share their movies online. So they're the same rules where, because even though we only run at the moment 1 dyno, the constraints of Heroku's platform mean you're already ready for horizontal scale. So you can treat it mentally as though you've got 2 because you know that you've built it and it will go to 2. So we're applying the same principles in a very different way because we're looking at the balance of the cost and the time of both the platform and our headspace because we're 3 guys working on good films. The biggest constraint after money is headspace. It's focus. We need to work on the big things, and we really want to be helping people find movies, not fiddling around doing ops stuff for a commercial product with 5 users. So that's kind of why we've set those things up. I hope that's informative. That's kind of the end of the talk. I've got time for lots of questions because I talk quickly.
Are there any questions? Yes.
Did that have to fail over?
The question was, have I ever had to fail over from the master to the slave? I've not done it in anger. I've done it in practice, and it was about 5 minutes. And that was only because I'd never failed over Postgres before. We've got cat tasks now to do it. Because it was just reading books and why is this file called backup.txt or whatever? What is it called? Recovery.conf for replication. And what a boondoggle legacy piece of crap. Any more questions? Well,
I'd like to hear some of the MongoDB hate stories. Why do you hate it so much? Tell me all about it.
I actually don't really hate it that much. I don't feel it has much place with the Rails app because of the so the question was, why do I hate MongoDB so much? Part of it is, as a Rails programmer, I'm a massive bandwagon jumper. The reality is, I don't hate it that much. If anything, I kind of think MongoDB as a semi-durable data store makes sense. Actually makes a lot of sense in a cloud deployment because the reality is your disks aren't that persistent anyway. So you need to design to actually reliably store data on the cloud. You need to be across multiple servers because one of them could just go at any time. So when Mongo says, well, even though we're not really that durable and it's kind of by design, we've got replica sets, do that. On the one hand, it's kind of easy to make some cheap jokes about that, but it actually makes sense. If cloud computing is so cheap and you can have 5 servers and you just can rely on the fact that at least one of them is going to store your data, no, that's fine. I'm honestly not taking the piss. So I've got a side project that I use Sinatra with Mongo because I want to fiddle with all the stuff and it's kind of nice to work with. But with Rails, you consider that the real strength of Rails as a platform is about we're all agreed on a common set of conventions. So one of those conventions, I feel, is use SQL, and that it's a bit more predictable, and it's about something that we all understand and agree on to deploy to. So if in Rails, stick with the boring shit. If you want to play with it if you want to use it because you feel really strongly it's a good technology, I say do it. But if you're not that fast, just stick with the common path. Just ride those rails. Anything else? Lenny?
I'd like to hear you talk more about the Postgres versus MySQL. And just a comment, one thing that strikes me is that like MySQL has RDS. That's pretty good.
Yeah, RDS is fantastic. I'd deploy to that. There's Heroku Postgres. There you go. I don't know. I really strongly prefer Postgres. It's from the development perspective, the MVCC model is really, really nice. It's clean. Most of the defaults in the config are sensible. But to take, for example, Envato does pretty fantastic things with MySQL databases, and they just work fine. And you know that Facebook do fantastic things with MySQL. If it was genuinely a toy database, or if it was broken, those things couldn't happen. So yeah, I don't really have super strong positions on it. I have super strong positions on people that do, which is they're dumb. Anything else? Yep.
Where do you think the first couple of challenges would be if you can make your choices and have really nice next layer and sort of separate? Where's the next challenge probably going?
So it really depends. If you are processing files in any way, that'll be it. It's always files. That's such a pain in the ass. I would say generally you're going to need more app resources before you're going to need to fiddle with your database, because Rails is not amazingly efficient. It's efficient in the holistic sense of developers, the amount of developers for the amount of work you do, but in terms of just in ops, you're going to run out of memory before you do anything else. And then if you're deploying to the cloud, like most people are, this is the other tricky thing, is so normally when I talk about this, I say you should deploy to the cloud. It's kind of part of the default stack. But you consider that DHH loves to post pictures of RAM and physical servers. So I strongly believe you should be deploying to the cloud, but a lot of the design pressures on the Rails project are about having access to lots and lots of RAM, which can be a little bit hard to find on Amazon from time to time. But yeah, I would say generally you'll end up going to 3, maybe 4 app servers before you even need to resize your primary database. It's not going to be I/O if you're not dealing with files. It'll be RAM, then CPU, then it'll be you wrote a dumb query on your database. Yes, Sir Trollolol?
Speaking of files, how do you feel about NFS?
I would say that NFS is a leading contributor to me leaving a large stock file marketplace. That's not true, but I hate it. I feel even worse about GFS.
What about MongoFS?
I believe something needs to store files before it be considered a file system. Any more kind of like easy to bat Mongo options?
If you're using Rails for the good sort of consumer side and then Sinatra for the other, why that, why not the other way around?
So funnily enough, it kind of comes down to YAGNI for me, is when you consider every time you type Rails new, you're actually violating YAGNI. You're making a lot of decisions about what the future of my app is going to be ahead of time. So I kind of like when you've only got 1 or 2 pages, which for an MVP you usually do, to just start it in Sinatra. I always pull in active record just as a standard, because I know it well, and that if I do go Rails way, that'll be fine, but not necessarily require all of Rails. It also helps because we're not sure when the app doesn't need to do that much. We don't need to pay the performance penalty of Rails as well, which means we can host it cheaper on Heroku, which then means I can put more attention into the main app that's changing more. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Mario?
You talked about RAM usage is one of the things that you did really early on. When you think about using a regional rhythm, it doesn't have a single process. The single process log, so you no GIL, so something like RubyConf or JRuby, and then using a threaded web server to combat the RAM usage.
So the question was, why not use JRuby RubyConf so that you have less of a memory constraint? For me, that violates the kind of simplicity goals of the stack, because all of a sudden you need to start managing thread counts and the heaps inside that. So I would rather buy RAM than spend time fiddling with threads and checking if every gem was thread safe and all these kinds of things. So that's why I don't really recommend it, but do it if you want. Anything else? Yeah?
What does your, you have some servers in the stack, how do you set those up? Do you just bash?
So we use an incredibly popular server provisioning system called Tango, written by an opinionated bald man from Envato. That's probably not specific enough, there's a few of those. It's Pete. Which is heavily inspired by Babushka, which is by Ben. So for those who don't know about, probably Babushka is a better example to talk about. It's kind of like Chef or Puppet, but test-driven, because everything has you define preconditions on your server. It must, respond on port 80, and then you tell it how to meet those preconditions. So that's the kind of setup we use. But this is something interesting. I was nearly going to do a slide about it. You kind of need to give yourself permission every now and then to cheat if you are like a Puppet or Chef type mob. So when we have to scale in a hurry, I just grab the latest DB backup and spin up a new server, not DB backup, take a backup of the server image because it's on the cloud, and just go make a new one of that. I'm not going to fiddle around installing stuff. If my platform gives me any way to cheat to respond to change faster in a sane way that won't affect maintainability, I'm going to do that. So yeah, we spin up new servers using something Babushka-like, and that's it.
Time to wrap up.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.